3 years have passed since this incident. My bus dropped me off at the station at around 1 in the afternoon after taking me back from a holiday outside of my city. 3 a.m. When I reached the main road, I started seeking for a cab to take me home. But neither a cab nor a person was to be found. I stood there for a good 5 to 8 minutes trying to flag down a cab on both sides of the street, but was unsuccessful. When suddenly I spotted a young woman wearing a white sari on my left. It is the traditional clothing for women in my nation. She was standing about 50 feet away, beneath a lamp, and she had just arrived there. It was very concerning that I hadn't seen her only a few moments before. However, I reminded myself that when I looked for a cab, I must simply have missed her. But as soon as I turned around to gaze the other way to hunt for a cab once more, my pulse began to race as I heard her speaking to me from a few feet away. She had arrived at my location quickly and very silently. When she asked, "Can you do me a favor?" my panic nearly caused my heart to burst out of my chest. At this moment, I was trembling. I backed up by 2 steps. This young woman wearing a white sari suddenly appeared to me at around 2 in the morning. She asked if I could help her out, explaining that she needed to get home and that it was getting late, but she would prefer someone to go with her. Not far from here was it. Just for clarification, at this time, men rarely venture out alone at night for the simple reason that it can be a highly dangerous time for a woman to be alone. Despite my dread, I walked with her since I was frightened for her safety if I didn't. We strolled. I didn't want to talk or look them in the eyes. I didn't even inquire as to her destination. I simply kept pace with her while maintaining a safe distance. It was unsettling that she remained silent the entire time we were on the road. We arrived at a steel fence after maybe 15 minutes of trekking. She expressed her happiness by thanking me and mentioning that she lived nearby. She circled and resumed her stroll. My curiosity prickled me in the breast, and I wanted to know just which direction she was traveling from here. I had assumed that my duty was through, so I started heading in the opposite direction to try to find my cab again. Just seconds after she left, I turned to check and there was nobody there. Given the brief amount of time that had elapsed since I had last seen her, I couldn't see her beyond the steel gate when I peered at it. The gate had a chain and padlock around it, which I discovered when I looked at it more closely. She could not possibly have opened it, locked it, and then entered in that brief period. At that point, I raised my head and noticed the gate's sign, which noted that it was a cemetery. I began to run. I hurried towards the mosque I had spotted in the distance, believing it would be a haven, opened the doors, and collapsed on the ground. Thinking I was the robber, the imam or priest approached me and greeted me with a bat. He approached me when he spotted me on the ground and inquired what had occurred. I told him everything that had happened. He acknowledged my understanding and related the following incident to me. A girl was sexually raped and killed 8 years ago. Her lifeless body was discovered next to the lamppost, the same lamppost where I had first spotted her. Her face was disfigured. Nobody was able to recognize her, and nobody showed up to claim the body. The perpetrators are still at large because there was no police complaint made. The locals buried her in the cemetery because no one had claimed the body. Since then, she has interacted with numerous people, mostly young men. Variously angry and peaceful. I'm delighted mine was different, and I don't believe I'll soon forget what I said to the late-night girl. I'm 7,000 individuals. Growing up in a small town makes you incredibly resourceful when it comes to coming up with enjoyable activities. You maximize your enjoyment of the moment. There are many urban legends, and they are entertaining to hear. I don't live too far from our capital, and as I grew older I began going there. I made a lot of friends, and they enjoyed hearing about the enjoyable activities we did while I was growing up in such a little town. They would urge me to take them to a nearby cemetery, which is about 40 minutes away. It's a location I've only visited a few times. I will grant that it is fairly unremarkable during the day. I've hunted there and taken numerous late-night drives, so I consider myself to be somewhat familiar with the area, but at night it gets quite unsettling. I'll say that right now. If something spooky looks at me, I'm not going into the paranormal. I'll try to think of a logical reason. I'll roll my eyes if you tell me a scary story, but this one has no justification. So, one evening, I received a call from some city pals. They asked me to take them out to this graveyard because they want to visit it. They come over to me after I say that I agree, and we all leave at 8:00 p.m. Mid-fall means that it is currently somewhat dark outside. There are 5 of us, and we stand around smoking a few cigarettes and catching up with one another until about 9 o'clock when we depart. A portion of this journey is on a paved highway, but the remaining distance, about 6, possibly 10 miles, is on limestone, gravel roads. At the moment, we drove my friend's brand new automobile. It was a reddish maroon Pontiac G6, and it was only a few months old. If you've ever driven on a limestone gravel road, you are aware of the fine white dust that settles on your car. The graveyard is reached by us. A huge cast iron gate serves as the entrance. We then enter, and I show them the grave marker. It's a huge one from the first decade of the 20th century, and it bears a rather unsettling message. In a similar vein, you will soon be where I am from where you are currently. After reading it, I learned that it's a feature present on many old grave markers. All of my pals agree. That is creepy, and they inquire as to whether I've ever experienced anything out here. Not really, no. Driving my automobile once caused it to overheat, but that's about it. This gravestone is located in the last row, facing west, and 50 yards or so to the south is a long series of tiny graves for children, with stones that were also fairly little, but just big enough for names. According to urban myth, if you zigzag between those graves as you sprint between them, you will perish. My friend begins to disparage me, calling it the silliest thing he's ever heard of. He shouts, "I don't fear any foolish dead infants." I said, "Man, I don't know. I've always heard that whenever it happened, the victim passed away a week later." He describes me as a fool. He begins to sprint through them. But after going halfway, he declares that he doesn't give a damn about the said curse. But he stops short of finishing the entire run and turns around to go back. He responded, "Yeah, I got spooked out halfway through when we made fun of him and asked him if he was too afraid to try. I was prepared to go once we returned to the entrance, had a few smokes, and briefly shot the breeze. I was becoming hungry, even though I hadn't eaten dinner. We started driving back to the town, where I live, at about 11 o'clock. There is a McDonald's on the southern edge of the city. We go inside to have dinner as soon as I pull up. When we got out of the car, it was well lit and beneath a street light. When we arrived, one of my friends counted 20 tiny handprints all over the vehicle. The size of them was of a 2-year-old, but they weren't all the same size and they were all very tiny. They were perched above the roof and the trunk. They were defined in the gravel road dust, so you could see them. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen to see fingerprints in the white dust, accentuating every crease. I recall looking very attentively. There is no justification. If they had been there when we left, the dust would have buried them. We were baffled as to how a child could have climbed onto this car. Where the car's owner lived, there were no children anywhere. Nothing made sense when we tried to think of a plausible explanation for why they might have been there. I warned my friend that he should be careful as he ran through the graves. Even now, if you bring it up with him, he will ignore you, walk out of the room, or become indignant at you for doing so. And it's been almost 20 years since that incident. We had a memorable adventure together, my sister and I. My family moved into a home next to a sizable cemetery when I was about 7 years old. My sister was 9 at the time. I'm referring to tens of thousands of graves here, combined with a mausoleum that most likely housed 100 individuals. Our house was hidden from the road by trees, but the length of our driveway allowed you to practically read headstones as you ascended it. My dad was a gravedigger at this cemetery at the time, thus it was convenient for my family. My sister and I were not afraid of this house or the graveyard when we were tiny children. We hadn't ever encountered the concept of paranormal phenomena. We would truly take our time strolling into the cemetery and past the nearby fountain. We would also visit our father when he was at work. But once we moved there, my parents started to have second thoughts about the house. They mentioned that the room had holes in the corners, suggesting that the home's former owner may have put security cameras there. But when we were young, we didn't fully understand why this would be strange. We used to share a house with my mom's mother. Her title was Nanny. She was somewhat fragile and had previously experienced strokes. She required assistance with several tasks and had trouble walking. Even though she was frail, her intellect was still clear at this point. Each room had a door to the bathroom, because my sister's room and my nanny's room were connected by a bathroom. My parents once left us with a nanny while they went grocery shopping. Although doing that certainly wouldn't have been a smart idea, my sister and I were rather well behaved. We wouldn't harm her or treat her unfairly. My sister and I were playing on the floor in the middle of my sister's room when the bathroom door, which was closed, started shaking erratically. It sounded like someone was grasping the doorknob and shaking it as hard as they could. We jumped up and headed for Nanny right away. We remained in her room until my parents returned, while she was seated in the space watching TV. She would have stated, so therefore I can be sure it wasn't her. She would not have been able to shake the door in that manner even then. She was simply too frail. In that home, my sister also experienced other strange occurrences, such as shadowy people peering in through the door crack of her bedroom. The majority of the time, we would also see a little girl with black hair outside of our house rather than inside. That was the only paranormal occurrence I've ever had, but it was meaningful to me, especially because my nanny was around to confirm that I wasn't the only one who saw it. I want to first describe something that it might confront. When I was a child, I had no idea who my granddad on my dad's side was because he tragically died when my dad was just 13 years old. Other than the fact that he had been in the Royal Navy, he remained a mystery to me. My nan never loved again after his untimely death, so I didn't want to ask my dad, uncles, or grandparents about him at that moment. When I was a small child, maybe 4 or 5, I recall that my grandmother had a photo of herself and a few other people in a pub on her nightstand. It was unclear which of the two men in the photograph was my grandpa. On to the major narrative now. 2012 was the year that this occurred, making me about 18 years old at the time. We visited our neighborhood graveyard with my 13-year-old brother, Dom, and myself. Although it seems morbid, we had good intentions when we went up there. Both our great-uncle Tom and older brother Louis were interred there, and we used to pay our respects by clearing the weeds from the graves and cleaning them. Wanted to use the restroom shortly after we were done. Fortunately, there was a restroom on the opposite side of the cemetery. I had the strangest feeling of being watched as we got closer. To our amazement, the toilet was locked when Dom tried to open it. This hardly ever took place. It was awful. He was in a hurry, and it took 20 minutes to get to our house. I advised him to pee behind the toilet so that nobody would see him. Then, 10 meters distant, I catch this guy glancing at me out of the corner of my eye. It was almost like a staring contest when I turned to face him. How much Uncle Andy, the sibling of my father, reminded me of him, but I was certain it wasn't him because he lived 2 towns away and would have approached me to inquire as to why the man was at the cemetery without glasses, which my uncle is required to wear or else he won't be able to see. I then asked Dom what's taking so long as I turned to face him, and the man in issue had left when I turned around. My brother and I questioned my nan about our enigmatic granddad a few weeks later. I therefore advised him to leave the subject if Nan didn't want to talk about it. As I previously mentioned, I didn't want to aggravate her. My brother then goes to my grandmother, and I hear him calling my name. So I head for her bedroom. She is beaming and excited to display photos of herself, my dad, and my uncles as I enter the room. One then attracted my attention. My grandfather was there. It resembled the man who was glaring at me in the graveyard exactly. Could it possibly be? I used to work at an office a few years ago that was directly next to a cemetery. Since I didn't get along with my coworkers, I frequently bought lunch downstairs and ate it on one of the benches in the cemetery because it was calm and quiet there, and I wasn't usually bothered. One day, I've just finished my sandwich and am sipping the last of my coffee while looking at something on my phone when I hear a baby wailing. I initially didn't pay attention. A parent carrying a child through a cemetery is undoubtedly not a reason for concern, but the infant won't stop sobbing. Those lungs never quit. I decide to turn around to check what is happening after about a minute or so has passed, because nobody has tried to comfort this infant in any way. I gently look around and spot a child perched atop a graveyard. I was genuinely alarmed by this. A sobbing infant on a cemetery site. Nobody is in sight when I look around. I carefully stand up so that I can take a closer look around before moving slowly in the direction of the baby to see where the parent is. However, I can't see anyone. I'm beginning to feel uneasy. In my neighborhood, I frequently heard stories of con artists who would leave a crying infant in the middle of the street or a remote location before leaping out of the bushes to loot the victim. In a fit of panic, I concluded that calling the police would be the best course of action because I truly didn't want this to be me. The infant continued to cry, and I kept scanning the bushes and trees. I started dialing 999 on my phone while keeping my eyes on the infant. When I pressed the dial, an operator replied right away. She inquired where I was when I started telling her about the sobbing infant at the graveyard. She promised to send someone over as soon as I told her about it. I waited because I didn't want the baby to leave. It was still wailing in my ears. I gazed at the infant after hanging up the phone and continued to scan the shrubs and trees in the area. I was settling for the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, I had overreacted. Additionally, this baby had been left in the cemetery for unknown reasons. Perhaps it was there to be found. I told myself that I would have to go and pick it up if no one arrived in a short period. A rustling from behind me caused me to jump as I began to approach the infant, but it turned out to be a squirrel. The infant and the noise vanished the instant I turn around. I nearly threw up a brick. A sobbing infant could not possibly have been present 1 second and absent the next. I swear, adrenaline flooded my body, and I'm embarrassed to say that I instantly went cold. I was powerless to intervene, my thoughts racing frantically to figure out how the hell a baby could have been there just a moment ago and not be there right now. I was unsure about what I was going to say to the cops. I was on the verge of mustering the confidence to leave and begin running to my office. I arrived, but as it was still lunchtime, I decided not to enter. Instead, I stood outside the cemetery and waited for the baby to emerge by magic, which it did not. A police officer showed up a short while later, and as they exited their vehicle, I went up to them and introduced myself. I rambled, but when they clarified, I said that I had seen and heard a baby. But then, the infant vanished. I anticipated receiving a reprimand or possibly being arrested for wasting their time. However, something about the way this policeman looked told me that wouldn't be the case. She gave me a sidelong glance and simply shook her head. She stated that it had been the third sighting of a baby at this cemetery in the previous year when I asked her what was going on. There was something spooky going on. But the police officers quickly left, so I never managed to get additional information from them. I avoided the area and never had lunch in the cemetery again. I also never heard the baby cry. However, I'm unsure if the infant is still crying. Out of the grave. The inexplicable has seemed to surround me for as long as I can remember, and as a result, I have plenty of ghost stories. Most of them aren't as reassuring as the one I'm about to share with you. A cemetery near where I live is tucked away from the road and concealed by a stand of trees that frames a tranquil creek. A story that not many of you are familiar with is the 13 unmarked graves. According to a local tale, there are 12 graves at the cemetery during the day, but there are 13 if you visit at night. Just a spooky story that makes people want to know more about the folklore. If I recall correctly, the majority of the graves at the cemetery date back to the Civil War, and the most recent grave I have discovered inside the cemetery's gates was from 1945. I enjoy going to cemeteries because they do make me feel at peace, and one of these excursions gave rise to the tale I'm about to tell. As the seasons began to change, the trees that encircled the cemetery slowly weeping orange, yellow-red, and brown leaves that littered the ground. It was a lovely day with sunshine and a pleasant temperature, It wasn't cold or excessively hot. When you live in a town with little to do, going for a drive with my folks is just something you do every day. My dad proposed that we revisit the cemetery to take another look at the headstones, but because we had already been there, we had no hesitations. As soon as we got out of the car and arrived, I did what I always do. I counted the 12 unmarked graves to see if there were still 12. I realize that's absurd, but it had become ingrained. My parents and I normally separate as we enter the cemetery because it is a sizable cemetery. Dad stays in the back, close to the car. My mother advances toward the center. I then advance toward the front closest to the road, and all we do is walk around looking at the graves to determine when and where folks were born. Although some individuals find it strange, we find it interesting. That day, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I proceeded down the row of graves, paying heed to the names, and had to put quite a distance between me and my mother. Dublin was in my little universe, trying to find a way to let the stress leave my body by getting back to nature and being in my environment. Heaven to me was the sound of the adjacent creek gushing water and the gentle wind rustling through the trees. However, that sense of being commonplace would go and be replaced by a sense of being observed. My neck's nape hair began to softly rise at first. My body responded to the abrupt change in my surroundings right away. I looked up naturally from the grave that had captivated my eye, a Civil War soldier who died in action. Based on the writing on the grave, he wasn't very old. However, the grave had drawn my interest, so I spent extra time admiring the worn-out stones there. But regardless, I jerked my gaze away from the burial markers and turned to face my parents. As they went forward very casually, none of their eyes were turning back. Instead, they were both intensely focused on the graves. I remained still as I scanned the area for the source of my bodily discomfort. I took in the landscape in front of me, gently moving my gaze around the cemetery until I spotted a lovely oak tree by the creek. Even though it was only a regular oak tree, what was nearby made my heart stop. He was a young man, slightly taller than I was 5'10", with stunning facial features and golden hair that glistened in the sun. Our eyes were locked, but there was some gap between us. And to be completely honest, I didn't realize how strange he was until I let my eyes gently droop down along his frame. I then became aware of the attire I had seen in so many history books. The lighter blue slacks were equally as loose-fitting as the dark blue coat which draped on the man's frame. His hat complemented his coat, a kepi. I believe they referred to it as that. My eyes landed on his face, and I realized I wasn't afraid. In all honesty, I was more interested in this man's identity and motives for observing me. It felt like hours between us as we just stared at each other. But it was just a minute before I heard my dad call my name and tell me it was time to leave. When I looked back, the man had vanished, leaving just the recollection and doubt. I had torn my eyes away from the man who was watching me because I wanted to hear my father, what I had observed. I attended my first funeral when I was around 9 years old. I strayed from the group while I was there and went to a cemetery where I saw a photo of a person and flowers, along with a modest peace offering. I wasn't told at the time, and I wasn't aware that taking flowers from someone's gravestone was rude. Consequently, I reached down to take a daisy that had grown over this person's grave. I encountered some resistance while doing so I pulled even harder. To my amazement, the daisy unexpectedly slipped out of my grasp and fell into the ground, as if someone had been dragging it from underneath. I put my hand over the spot where the daisy had just been since I was so perplexed by it. Needless to say, it made an impression on me, and as a result, I never treated a cemetery disrespectfully again. It also made me aware of what a spooky place a cemetery can be. I returned to the group and pretended as if nothing had occurred. Looking back, I believe I intended to present the flower to my mother, but I was unaware of the repercussions of taking these flowers from a deceased person's grave. In the year 2000, my family relocated from Kansas to Tennessee. At my new high school, I made some friends, and on Halloween, we all hung out together. We were told of a local myth known as the ghost flame. They wanted to check them out, so a number of my new acquaintances invited me to go with them. I attended despite my skepticism, out of curiosity. This is how the legend goes. There is a spooky cemetery out in the middle of nowhere. You can see a phantom flame hanging above a grave if you park on the side of the gravel road near the entrance and switch off your headlights. I got the impression that someone was playing a practical joke on me. We all drove there after one of the guys took his father's car for the trip. After stopping our headlights at the entrance and waiting for about 5 minutes, someone yelled, "Oh my God, look." A tall flame was visible hanging over a cemetery right in front of the monument. The flame vanished instantaneously when the car's driver turned on the headlights. When he turned them off, it gradually turned back on. Even though I couldn't believe what I was seeing, I strolled up to the cemetery to investigate since I didn't want to be the target of some joke. I could see that this flame was rather tall and was hanging about 6 inches off the ground when I got closer to it. More like a torch flame than short like a candle. It started to fade as I drew nearer, then completely vanished as I approached the grave. I assumed there would be a torch of some sort on the ground, but there wasn't. I would have heard someone racing into the woods or seen them do so. There were no large enough graves to hide behind. There was no way to bury anything in the grave because it was a huge stone slab. I struggled to think of a rational reason. The other youngsters in the group were as perplexed as I was. We were more in amazement and disbelief than anything else. We weren't particularly afraid. Never in my life have I witnessed anything so peculiar. Such a long time ago. I don't remember where the cemetery was because I was unfamiliar with the area and had no idea where I was, but I believe I have found it using Google Earth. We encourage skepticism and comparable experiences. Please let me know if you live in Robertson County and you've heard of the legend. Our context. The novel is set in the extremely small village where I formerly resided. When I worked at McDonald's, a girl named Lacey and I became co-workers. We bonded well. She then extended an invitation to attend a movie with her at her home after some casual flirtation. I hadn't even turned 20 yet, since this would be my first date as an adult. I'm anxious. No longer any of that kid crap. So, we didn't live that far apart from one another that particular night after she revealed her residence to me. Small town. I know. I would now need to go a few streets, the large park in the middle of the town, past the cemetery that was adjacent to the park, and then a few roads over to get to her house from mine. It was a 20-minute walk at most, but after planning my route, I advised myself to allow 30 minutes. So at 6, I stepped outside as the sun was about to set, afflicted with worry at the age of 30. It struck me while I was walking through the cemetery and noticed some flowers on a grave that I had not purchased any gifts for her. Not a bottle of wine, not anything at all. Or this was a bad choice. I became anxious and turned to look at the flowers below. They had recently been abandoned in plastic wrap on top of a grave. I did not even think twice. I was young and foolish when I leapt the gate to the cemetery, collected the flowers, which were still marked with the price, and headed back to her house, feeling proud of my new find. I assured myself that the deceased wouldn't miss these. She thanked me and placed the flowers in a vase with water when I gave her the bouquet. We then sat down on her couch and had a few drinks and some food, and she cooked popcorn as we waited to choose a movie. I sat there feeling apprehensive because I wanted to kiss her as she scrolled through the selections. I don't recall which movie we chose, but once we got to playing, I knew that my main goal was just to get my arm behind her head, to see if I might perhaps start something. I received the impression that she could want it as well. I was unable to verify. Set aside that point. I wasn't listening. I was trying to muster the guts to reach out and place my arm behind her neck as these ideas were simply racing through my head. All I could think of was that. When, at a particularly dark period in the movie, I noticed someone walking behind us in the reflection. I'm a little perplexed. She informed me of her mother and father's absence and the fact that they wouldn't return for another 2 days as soon as I arrived. I found this to be fantastic. Blanche is without a parent's house, but witnessing that made my spine tingle. "Does anyone else reside here with you other than your parents?" I inquired of her. She responds, "No, just us." I choose to keep calm so as not to startle her. But all of a sudden, it was not where my attention was directed, focusing in on whatever the hell I had just witnessed. It was at this moment. I was still watching TV and planning my next move when an unexpected event occurred. I had placed the flowers in the vase, but it collapsed and broke on the ground. We both leaped at it. I shouted. We both stood up to investigate. She stopped the movie and stared in shock at me. However, I placed them in the center of the table. As you can see, the vase was at least a meter away from its original location. It was on the floor. She turned to face me as I turned to face her. I then decided to tell her that I had seen something stroll behind us, right after I had asked her that question in the TV's reflection, since I thought this was way too eerie to keep to myself. Marcy erupted in fear. I assured her that everything would be okay and that she wouldn't experience any strange effects. Although I have no idea how I can ever fulfill that vow. I was feeling brave at the time since she was so terrified. We then decided to cuddle up on the sofa after picking up all the glass fragments and placing the flowers in a different, smaller vase. She was afraid, so I could have my arm around her shoulder much more easily than previously. The following morning, as I'm making my way back home, I take a deliberate moment to gaze at the grave from which I had taken the flowers. I felt a pang of discomfort and realized that perhaps I had been a little impolite in stealing the flowers off someone's grave. I'm not sure if it was just a coincidence, a trick of my mind, or the shame I may have deliberately suppressed. But as I turned to gaze at the tomb, I noticed the deceased's name, April Sams. She passed away recently, at the young age of 9. That in some way made things worse. I thus made a U-turn, went to a nearby supermarket, and purchased a barbecue and a considerably larger bouquet. I apologized, placed the barbecue and the flowers on the grave, and then continued walking toward my house. I'm not sure if I placated the ghost or if it was all in my head, but after that, I didn't experience any more spookiness. Lacey didn't either. In the end, it never really worked out for us. Nevertheless, it continues to rank among the creepiest things that have ever happened to me. I will never be able to tell if I caused it to happen to me or not because I took those flowers. But even so, I've learned to show more respect and stop taking things from the dead. Both my pal and I. Since our parents are also friends, they decide to go along since we enjoy taking pictures of abandoned buildings. There is an old mental institution that has been abandoned that dates back to the late 1800s or early 1900s and is about 5 hours from where we live. We finally arrived at this location after driving halfway across Virginia. While exploring the area outdoors, we decided to visit the old, nearby graveyard, where all of the patients were interred. In addition, they conducted some flawed tests on the inmates, which was, in my opinion, rather typical of mental hospitals in the past. However, as my mother, a former X-ray technician, examines the object as we continue up the graveyard's path, she comments that it appears to be a human arm bone. I follow that up with something like, "Oh, that's lovely." I wasn't particularly alarmed or terrified. All I could think was that this was a cemetery, and cemeteries had bones in them. The remainder of the trip was also a lot of fun, except for the redneck who yelled at us for briefly stopping on his land, because we got lost. However, discovering that was a little frightening. The majority of my family, and a few other families from my neighborhood, are buried in a tiny cemetery that is about half a mile up the road from my home. It's a pretty rural neighborhood with an orange orchard across the street and cattle fields on 3 sides. In the front, there is a chapel that is just a pole barn with 2 rows of benches below the roof. It provides seating and shade for holding services. I remember being on my way home from work a few months ago. It was probably around 11, 30 hours later. She was a slender woman sitting in the chapel's front row when I noticed her as I was walking by the graveyard. She was wearing a white sundress and a large floppy hat and stood next to a suitcase. The 2 houses on the road were completely dark, and there were no other people or cars in the cemetery. It was enough to make my hair stand on end as I drove through, even though I didn't feel attacked, terrified, or anything else. I don't know why, but during the past several days, I've been thinking about her once more. I have no idea for whom she was holding out, but I hope they were able to meet. I experienced this last night. I was out on a walk with my best friend when we decided to visit her grandmother's grave and light a candle in her honor. She informs me that she noticed something when we were approaching the cemetery from the street and were ready to enter it. We were moving toward the tomb when I heard something and stopped to take a look. I explained to her that she was just stressing out. It was 9 p.m. I was frightened to see that my pal had moved a few paces forward. I halted when I saw a dark creature with an extremely white face standing by a grave. My friend kept calling to me because she saw that I had halted and was frozen. After a few seconds of silence and inaction, I informed her we had to leave. All I could say, when she asked what was wrong, was that we had to get out here. I informed her what I had seen a short while later, and she told me to leave since she had also seen what I had. We both started to run as the monster was watching us exit the graveyard. Although I don't tend to believe in the paranormal, what they and her both witnessed rendered us both stunned. To set the scene, we went to the Independence Cemetery in Indiana, which is something we frequently do on July 4 because we were all uncertain about our plans for the evening and my partner's mother suggested we go. I've only been there 3 or 4 times, and this was the first time I exited the vehicle when we arrived, because their parents never really allowed us because the energy was always off. This time, their father decided not to accompany us, so I was free to wander around freely on the muggy night while my girlfriend followed. Being the Ryan to Shane's Ryan in this time travel trip, I teased ghosts and everyone else who would listen, and I do it frequently. My partner doesn't support my number. They find it amusing. To lighten the situation, my companion shot images of me behaving foolishly, crouched, and acting crazy, while I whistled at the nighttime racetrack and teased and just being a bother and an idiot. The following day, I left for home because my parents had just returned from Michigan and I had plans with them that afternoon. My partner messaged me after I had done cleaning the house, sending me a picture and wondering what the hell I was seeing. Although this could just be the saturation being slightly increased, as I looked attentively into the darkness, I felt it resembled a corpse. We discussed a variety of possibilities, but my point was still valid. That possibly, after our foolishness, something wanted to show up to frighten us, but didn't have a chance to.